What I realized was product is a way of thinking, no matter what your title says, even when it's the opposite of product. The reality is you're always trying to figure out what is it that your customers actually need from you in that role, and then how are you going to deliver that?
Welcome to the Product Weekend podcast with Brito, Moita and João. We hope you enjoy.
Hi, welcome to the Product Weekend podcast. Today with me, Rui Galvão Brito and João Moita. In this episode, we had a chance to talk with Radhika Dutt. Radhika is the author of Radical Product Thinking. She's an entrepreneur and product leader who has participated in 5 acquisitions, 2 of which were companies that she founded. She advised organizations from high-tech startups to government agencies and is currently advisor on product thinking to the Monetary Authority of Singapore and also serves on the board of the independent publisher Barrett Kohler. Hope you enjoy this chat where we'll cover topics such as product as a life skill, the radical product thinking approach, product diseases, and many more. See you in a bit. So let's start with one question that normally we like to ask, and regarding this is like the Product Weekend podcasts. How was your recent weekend that you really did enjoy?
Oh my gosh, this is probably going to be the hardest question on the whole podcast. How was my weekend? I think it was good. I relaxed a lot. The trip to Lisbon was fantastic. The Productized 2023 was absolutely a fantastic conference. Everyone, I recommend you to go get to it next year if you didn't already. And I think it took me a couple of weekends to kind of wind down from it because it was such a wonderful experience.
So yeah, still getting recovered from that week.
We feel the same.
I don't think I've ever stayed up that late in a very long time.
Yeah.
Well, you are one of the most respected names inside of the product world. But could you give us a little bit of your introduction, how you moved into product, how everything happened?
Yeah, so my path to product was a truly meandering one. So my background is that I did electrical engineering at MIT as an undergrad and also in grad. But, from there to product, it wasn't an obvious thing to me at all. I didn't ever know that I wanted to do something called product. And in fact, like the first thing that I did right out of school or while still in school was our first startup where we wanted to revolutionize wireless, right? And I was working on sales and business development in that case. In the next startup, I was still working in business development. Then my role was custom engineering, like program manager for custom engineering at a large company called Avid. And we were in broadcast and media and entertainment. Like every Hollywood movie was made using Avid, right? And we were working on getting into broadcast. And that title that I had of program manager of custom engineering is the diametric opposite of product, anything that we stand for in product. And then I did, strategy, I did marketing, and it was in a variety of companies, all the way from telecom, robotics. And then I was the CEO of another startup, which was my own company doing wine. And so then you say, well, okay, so how did you get to product possibly, right? What I realized was product is a way of thinking, no matter what your title says, even when it's the opposite of product. The reality is you're always trying to figure out what is it that your customers actually need from you in that role, and then how are you going to deliver that? What's the most scalable way of delivering that? Once you start thinking about what's the change that you want to create for that set of end users, or what's the change you want to start creating for that for the world, for those people, right? Not for everyone, but what's the world you want to create for those end users? That was the realization after working in a range of companies, range of industries, and in a range of different roles, that our product is our mechanism to create change. And that's how radical product thinking was born, because of all the mistakes that I made along the way and things that I had to learn along the way through hard lessons.
That's very interesting. And it's actually a common theme that we touched on the previous episode with Randy, that product is more a way of thinking and a skill set than a specific position. no matter how much the specific role will change, the mindset is the same and the differentiating for product people.
I love what you said, because there was a mentor in my early years who told me, sales is really a life skill. And it's true, sales is a life skill. But I'll say that product is also actually a life skill. That was the realization I got. And Radical Product Thinking, when I wrote the book, it really helps you apply this life skill both to products at work and what we're building. But once you start thinking about product in this way, that it's your mechanism to create change, then you start thinking about everything like a product. So, for example, when I was working with the head of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, as he read the book and as we worked together, one of the things he said to me was, even government policy is a product, because when you create a government policy, you're thinking about what's the change you want to create in the market. Yeah. And your policy is that product to bring about, or the mechanism to bring about that change. And then your UX or the front end for that product might be a form or, whatever submission is required from them. That's just an example of a government policy, but you start thinking like this. Even parenting is a product. What's the change you want to create in the world through your kids? Activism is a product. And what do you want to do with your volunteering, and how are you creating change through that? And the fundamental idea behind all of this then is, once you start thinking in this way, the reason product is a life skill is because you start to engineer change. Whatever that mechanism is, you're always engineering change, and it's a constantly improving mechanism for creating change. And that's really product thinking.
And also looking for the best way to scale without being too demanding of work for the next times. Like the next iterations will be easier to scale than now.
That's cool. I think both Rui and myself are eager to jump into radical product thinking and product diseases because we've been touching on a lot of those points. But before going there, you mentioned a mentor of yours, and that's what I would like to ask. Who has been some, or have been some mentors of yours that have helped you in your career? Maybe 2 or 3 that impacted you the most.
The one I was just mentioning, Sharon, she has been a mentor and a friend for a very long time. She helped me on our first startup that we did together, and this was back in 2000, so we've kept in touch for 23 years and we're friends. The biggest things I learned from her, one thing was, what I said, sales being a skill set, but also, she validated so many of my experiences as a woman in the tech industry and helping me find my voice, so that, very often as a woman, what you say is interpreted as, oh, this is very aggressive. You're not looking for buy-in. How do you find the right voice so that you can be heard? And validating experiences that sometimes what a guy says is considered like, oh, he's such a good leader. A woman says the same thing and she's heard as, oh goodness, she's so aggressive. So that was one example of a mentor. A second mentor is someone who really helped me do a better job of storytelling. Like, he was a mentor in sales who, the way he tells his stories, they're so exciting. You can't help but listen to him. And there was something about that I learned from him. And then one other mentor I'll mention is David Schleifer, whom I worked for at Avid. I was in my early 20s at the time, right? And if I think about my role, by the way, this was the same role where my title was Program Manager for Custom Engineering. Mm-hmm. And I remember, I was very often involved at that age in negotiating with executives of broadcasting companies. And I remember I was at a conference where I was presenting and a sales guy came up to me from the company and he goes like, oh, I thought you were a lot more senior. Like, okay, that's not a nice comment, number one. But number two, I mean, if you think about what he was really saying, the amount of empowerment I had and how much I had a sense of direction and what I was able to achieve at the company was outsized compared to the actual title I had and the role I had. Yeah. And the reason that was possible was because of this mentor. And he was my boss, and he was incredibly empowering. Like, he had such clarity of vision in terms of what he wanted for broadcast. And then he never micromanaged beyond that. Once that was clear to me, it was really up to me to kind of run with it and then go to him when I had questions. I have never had such amazing management
Yeah.
after that in like 20 years, right? Which is why, by the way, I do consulting, but
That's
and I
the,
help others become better managers.
yeah. No, but that's a great example of something that can be life changing, especially earlier in your career. If you have
It's
a
fundamental.
good boss that empowers you, trusts you, and also that can spread their thinking, as we've discussed, like allow other people to get what's inside their brain in a way. That's super powerful.
Exactly. He was the one who really showed me the power of that. When you're able to scale your thinking as a leader so that people around you are able to make decisions like you would without you having to be in every meeting.
That's mind blowing because you can also have the other side of the coin and the early age steps with your manager. That's like the key steps for your future, maybe like for your next 10 years, because they can be traumatic or completely life changing for the positive ways. Yeah.
So true.
So let's start our deep dive more into the podcast. So we want to talk a little bit about product diseases. This is not the medicine one, but you were one of the first introducing and talking about this term of product disease. And we'd like to know if you could elaborate a little bit more of first, what do we consider a disease? And second, if you have a menu for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So product diseases are diseases that get in the way of products. So they make good products go bad, and very often they kill innovation. And what I've realized is we have to talk openly about product diseases because they're so common, irrespective of which industry or size of company you're in, right? And so I'll give you some examples of product diseases that I have caught myself and then have had to learn the hard way how to recover from them, right? So the first one I'll tell you about was in the startup that I founded when I was still in my dorm room at MIT with the co-founders. The disease was hero syndrome, where we were just focused on being big. Like our vision, as I mentioned, was revolutionizing wireless, where we had no idea what revolutionizing wireless meant, but that's what we were going to do. You know, we were just focused on being big, how much VC money we were raising, etc., without really having clarity on what is the problem we're setting out to solve in the first place. So that's hero syndrome. I'll give you a couple of other such examples that really resonate for people. Another example that's common both in startups and large companies is pivotitis. Right? Pivotitis happens when we keep jumping from one shiny idea to another. And this can happen either because we're a startup and, today we try one thing that doesn't work, and then we try another thing, and then we try another thing, and so on, right? But what people often don't realize, even though media makes you think that the way to build a successful company is by constantly pivoting, the reality is you have 2 to 3 pivots before you run out of either money or momentum. No matter how much money you have, the reality is, like, at some point your team starts to think you have no idea what you're doing. We're just jumping from one thing to another.
Yeah.
They lose trust in what you're doing, right? So that's pivotitis.
Do you think that lean startup and everything around it kind of is making that we are saying like, oh, no worries, we can pivot and everything will be fine again?
Yes, exactly. That is exactly what's happening. So it's lean startup, but I'll also share one other angle why pivotitis is so common. If you think about how the VC model works, the way the VC model works, they invest in 10 startups and they only need one of them to be successful. The rest all, they want them to fail quickly, right? And so their view is try lots of things and see what works. So pivot from one thing to the next really quickly, and then let's see what works. But that's not good for the entrepreneur. From the entrepreneur's perspective, you don't want to run out of money quickly, right? Like you want to use your pivots like silver bullets and say, okay, what am I going to pivot to? This doesn't mean that we never pivot. But the way we avoid pivotitis is by having this clarity of, okay, what problem are we solving? Why does it need to be solved? What's the end state we envision? At least as a hypothesis. Even if you don't know the true answers to any of this, you can have a hypothesis for all of this. And then when you learn something new in the market, you go back to your hypothesis and you say, actually, we learned that we were wrong about this. We thought that this was the problem we were solving and this is the end user. We were wrong. And then you can say what we learned from it and what we're going to do instead. That is a much better way to pivot. Then you avoid pivotitis, as opposed to like making your team feel like every time this is a wild swing from one thing to the next and they get whiplash effect. I'll talk about a couple of more, but the rest are in the book. So there are 7 diseases I talk about in the book, but I'll talk about one more, which is something I've done as well, obsessive sales disorder, which is where, your customer says, this is a wonderful product. I'll buy it if you add this one custom feature to it. Your salesperson is very eager. They can see all the big revenues and dollar signs coming out of this. So you say, okay, I'm going to do this, right? And this is where our product keeps growing with all these custom features, and that's obsessive sales disorder. This happens when we're being really sales-led and we keep adding custom features. And I'll give you one last example, and this is really in an engineering-led organization, which is narcissist complex, where we keep building things saying, oh, if I had this feature, I know I'd use it. And so we're so in love with our own features and with our own goals, by the way, sometimes like, oh, we need to focus on delivering this because that's our goal. Then we forget what is it that the customer needs. And that's narcissist complex when we're focused on ourselves.
Or even try only the most state-of-the-art technology without even know if that's exactly what will fit.
Shoving
And by the way,
AI into everything. Right.
Exactly. And one common symptom is if we start talking about use cases, that's already narcissist complex, because it's like we're already focused on a technology and we want to define use cases for this technology.
Yeah, going the other way around.
Super common in blockchain, for example. It's amazing technology, but how can we use it? And just for our listeners, could you reveal the name of the other 3?
Yes, of course. So let me mention the other 3. So one is locked-in syndrome, which is where we're so focused on what's worked well in the past that we feel like, why change what's not broken? It's the resistance to change. Then there is hypermetricemia, which is so common because we want to be data-driven. And it's the obsession with data and metrics without thinking about, is this the right thing to measure in the first place? And then the last one I'll mention is strategic swelling. And this is what happens when our product starts to get bloated because it keeps expanding to try to do everything for everyone.
It's more than the one size fits all, right?
Exactly.
That's cool. Thanks a lot for sharing. Now, if people want to learn more about those and how to cure them or avoid them, get the Radical Product Thinking book. You have all the details there, right?
Yeah, and the book talks about how you can be more vision-driven. What I've found is all of these diseases, they creep in whenever there is a break in the chain from translating a vision that you have into reality. What often happens is we think of people as visionaries in this world when they're really good and seem to have this innate skill at translating a vision for change into reality. And the whole book was born because of this burning question I had that, do all of us have to learn through these hard mistakes and hard lessons? Or can anyone learn how to build great products in this very systematic way? Like this whole philosophy that you have to be an Elon Musk and a visionary, and that's kind of the definition of a visionary, I think is very toxic in the world. We need a step-by-step process for how can we create change, starting with vision and translate it into action. And that's what the book helps us do.
That's cool. It's a bit like, does everyone need to get sick to get immunity, or can you create a vaccine that avoids people getting actually sick? That's
exactly.
Much better,
And it's been answered, but definitively.
Cool.
Yeah, we did it as a society. We prove it. One thing that I like to ask is, for example, how can a product manager, in this case, let's go for a company to already some different layers of hierarchy. So you are a product manager, but you have like 2 or 3 different managers up in the hierarchy. How can you, as the product manager, help treat those diseases or helping the vaccine for those diseases?
Yeah, such a great question. And I am asked this so often, right? Because all of this concept of having clarity of vision and then translating it into action, it feels like something that only someone at a senior level who has authority can do. And here's what I recommend. Yes, of course, if you have that clarity at a high level, that is wonderful. Creating change top down is always easier than bottom up. But even if you feel like you don't have that authority and power, you can create change. And I've had to do this at a company where I felt like the high level leadership team didn't necessarily have a vision. But even for yourself, if you work through these questions of take out the radical product thinking templates and you work through the vision strategy, what you'll discover for yourself is you'll suddenly have so much more clarity that you'll be able to give that clarity to your own product team. And then you'll be able to sort of etch away at leadership as well and be able to give them some clarity and introduce that slowly. Even for yourself, it just feels so much more satisfying to have that sense of direction. And my own experience was when I was able to take that approach of giving my team clarity, we created two separate cultures. There was the culture within my product team, and then there was a culture in the rest of the organization that almost didn't matter. Like my whole team stayed with me for the longest time because we had such a shared sense of purpose. You can make that happen for your team, right? And you can do that even as an individual contributor. And it's incredibly empowering to have that clarity for yourself. And it's only when you have that clarity for yourself that you can facilitate conversations with other stakeholders and your leadership team to be able to get them to slowly change their minds.
Is what we can try to influence a little bit from bottom top. Every time do our parts and try to lead by example, even if we are not the leaders, but at least lead us, and that will reflect.
Yeah, and maybe I can talk about some concrete tips in terms of what I've found works really well. People often say to me that I can't just come in and challenge the vision that the company has, saying, we already have a vision, but we need to change it, people. Like, that's hard for me to do. And of course, that is very hard to do. So here's a different tact you can take instead. Next time, when you have to make a product decision, think about the product decision on two dimensions, where draw up the y-axis, where you think about, is this particular feature good for the vision or not, right? And then the x-axis is it helping us survive or not? And so that's basically helping you think about long-term versus short-term. And any leader, they're always in their heads balancing any decision between long-term and short-term. So when you start making this explicit for your team on an X and a Y axis, just like that mentor that I told you who had such clarity and was able to scale his thinking, you're doing that for your team in terms of how you're balancing long-term against short-term. As you plot this feature on these two axes, if it's good for both vision and survival, right? That's great. That's ideal. That's usually easy. And you'll have various degrees of what is ideal in this quadrant. The other quadrant that is actually much harder is vision debt, where it's good for survival. So, for example, it's going to bring in that quick sale, but it's bad for the vision, like that custom feature. This is where you're taking on vision debt. And the opposite of vision debt is where you're investing in the vision. This is where it's good for the vision in the long term, but in the short term, it's not bringing in revenues. An example of this is where you're refactoring code or spending time doing user research. Even as you think about where this feature goes, you can use this 2x2 to talk to stakeholders. And the reason for doing that is now that helps you talk to your stakeholders saying, this is how you think of the features. This is why you feel like maybe you shouldn't do it because this is vision debt and how it's going to create obsessive sales disorder in the long term if we keep adding more and more vision debt. And over time, they'll be able to see visually how much vision debt they're adding and how rarely they're investing in the vision. So you start to give them a visual representation, and that makes decisions less contentious for two reasons. One, this gives you power in the conversation where you're at the whiteboard and you draw up vision versus survival. Even your body language is putting you in a position of a facilitative conversation enabler, right? Like this is putting you in the position of guiding the conversation. And now you're not arguing over, I think we should do this, you think we should not. This is more like, well, talk to me about, do you think this is good for the vision or not? And talk to me about whether this is good for survival or not. Now it's not a my thought, my opinion versus yours. It's less contentious. And it begs this next question. Why do you think it's good for the vision? Are we in alignment on the vision? This is my thought in terms of the vision. This is how you start to sneak in these ideas and your clarity.
That's super useful. Like these frameworks and ways of thinking are, in the end, communication tools to allow you to start the right conversations at the right time. And yeah, like to, as you were saying, to stand up and go to the board, even if you don't have the right framework, just go to the board and start sketching stuff, and you'll at least be in the position.
But it helps when you have such a framework, so that
if it's not just random drawings.
Cartoons.
Yeah, it could be funny, and you could get some break the ice and create a connection with the audience. That could also work.
At least that.
Yeah.
You could put it up.
So, Radhika, and with everything that we are hearing, and we already been talking about radical thinking methodology a lot here, but could you give us a little bit more of, I don't want to say if I want an overview, but like a little bit of a deep dive?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the idea with radical product thinking is that we can engineer the change we want to bring about in a very systematic way. So that means starting with this clarity of what's the vision that we have, what's the vision for change? Because without thinking about what's that end state, you can't build a product. As we talked about, product is your mechanism for change. So what's the vision for change? Then translating it into a strategy or a set of actionable steps, then into a set of priorities and how you balance vision against survival. Then how do you measure progress? And then finally, using all of these elements to engineer culture. Now, the thing is, right, all of these words are words that we've heard before. Like we've heard vision, strategy, and at this point, it sounds like a yawner where you say, yeah, I've heard this. There's nothing radical sounding, right? And so this is where I think a deep dive helps, where, okay, let's talk about vision as an example. Until now, everything that we've heard about what is a good vision is, it has to be big. It has to be aspirational. It should never change. That's something that's so far out that it's unachievable. I can only say to all of this that it's a bunch of bullshit. Like it all sounds good. And we've heard that it has to sound inspirational and short so that people can memorize it. It all turns out to be not true. So here's why. What you truly want is a vision that acts like a filter, where if you hold up a feature against this vision, sometimes the answer should be, don't do it. If you have a vision that's so broad, so let's take that example, right? And often in my talks, I would give the example that let's say I have the vision, and this is the actual vision of a company, to create human progress by empowering people to express themselves, right? If I have a vision this broad, practically anything goes under this vision. My kids have a piano teacher who is empowering them to express themselves. This could be her vision. This could be the vision of social media. It could be the vision of a dance studio. Anything goes. And so that's not a useful vision at that point. So, okay, if it's not broad, what should it be? A good vision is something that gives you enough clarity on 5 things. First is, whose world are you trying to change? It's not everyone. The second thing is, what exactly is their problem? And how are they solving it today? The third thing then is, why does that problem need to be solved? Because maybe it really doesn't. And we're just assuming that it does. This is so often the case where we disrupt for the sake of it. And Joao, you brought up the example of blockchain. That was one of those things where we thought we were disrupting something and we still haven't found like really valid places where that is the only solution and the right way to solve it. Then we have the next question, which is, when can you say mission accomplished? Like, what does the end state look like if you've solved the problem? And then finally, and this is finally where you're allowed to speak about your product, how are you going to bring this about with your product? And so I'll give you an example of what I mean when you answered these questions in the radical product thinking way. This is a fill in the blank statement so that you're not focused on the words, but rather you're focused on answering these hard questions. Here's the example of a startup that I had. Today, when amateur wine drinkers want to find wines that they're likely to like and learn about wine along the way, they have to find attractive looking wine labels or wines that are on sale. This is unacceptable because this leads to so many disappointments and it's hard to learn about wine this way. We envision a world where finding wines you like is as easy as finding movies you like on Netflix. We're bringing about this world through a recommendations algorithm that matches wines to your taste and an operational setup that delivers these wines to your door. And so, this kind of a vision, it's super detailed. A year later, this might change. Even 5 months later, it might change, right? As markets change, as you learn more. And then you revisit and make changes. But the important part was the power of this was I had told you nothing about my wine startup that I had, but you knew exactly what we were trying to do and why we were doing it. And that's what you need from your vision. Nobody needs to memorize it. In fact, every time I say this, maybe some words are different. The whole point is that your team needs to internalize it so that they will say it in their own words and as their vision.
When should we revisit the vision? Because you just said like market change, everything changed, and that's true. Should it have like, for example, recurrent six month thing just to go like, is it still
How
on?
to avoid getting into the locked in syndrome, right?
Exactly. There you
Exactly
go.
that.
Yeah, exactly. You're exactly right that, we should revisit it at least every 6 months to a year. When you're doing strategic planning in a large company, absolutely. Like you really should be looking at that vision every year. Ideally, really every 6 months as a product person, you should be looking at that and saying, is it still valid? But this also depends on kind of what stage are you at in terms of your product. If you're an early stage startup, I mean, I was learning things about what the users needed every month or every quarter at the very least. And I'd need to revisit and say, is this still valid? And maybe you need to look at that and decide what are you going to test and what do you need to learn more about. Sometimes the power of this vision is in telling you what you don't know. It helps you recognize what you don't understand.
Yeah, that's super powerful. And you were saying that anyone can use this, and I just wanted to share a short story that Sergio, my colleague with Product Weekend, we used the framework for another idea we had before starting the Product Weekend retreats. And going through this exercise really made us ask and think about the details and the things that we were not considering or overlooking. And luckily, we realized that that was not a viable thing to pursue. And luckily, we ended up getting together to build a Product Weekend retreat. So quite happy that we used this at the right time to pivot at the right moment.
That's such a fantastic example, right? And sometimes the power of it is in helping you avoid even going down a direction and then having to pivot later. So that was great. Like you have only a certain amount of pivots that you have. And that was an example of using or not using up a pivot and saving it for later, right?
Now, getting back to a little bit more here regarding the radical product thinking, what are the real dangers if we try to follow more of an iteration-led approach instead of the vision-driven?
Yeah. So when we take an iteration-led approach, these product diseases become very common because what happens is in our organization, when everyone is trying to be lean and agile, and by the way, this has happened so much, especially because we all recognize that agile is the way to go, and agile helps us move fast. But the danger is we're all moving fast and in different directions. So it really looks like chaos. And that's really where these product diseases creep in. So that's the danger of being iteration led, where our iterations are not driven by this clarity of vision and strategy. So what I want people to do is not say that we're not going to iterate. By all means, iteration is good, but it's just putting some direction to what are we going to iterate towards? Like, what's the end state that we want to bring about, and then having clarity of strategy. So we talked about vision, for example, being able to translate that into identifying personas, pain points, and therefore what are the solutions, and therefore what is the underlying engine, and what does this mean for the business model, sales channels, that sort of level of detail of strategy, for example. Like that's a whole framework in in radical product thinking. So being able to add vision and strategy so that our iterations have a very clear direction. The one thing I want to clarify is being vision driven doesn't mean that you're slowing down by any means, because people so often tell me, well, we don't have time for strategy. And this is not to slow us down. It's just to make our iterations more efficient. So we've thought about what is worth iterating on.
Yeah, it's not worth it to run fast if you're running in circles. You need to have a direction.
Exactly. And that's what happens when we're iteration led sometimes. Like what I see so often is that our iterations are very small changes that don't truly move the needle, right? So I remember there was this one experiment that Professor Dan Ariely was running. This was when we were still at MIT. Now Dan Ariely is so famous, but we got to work with him in one of his early experiments. And I remember it was this experiment where you were digging oil fields. And basically, like when you found oil, you had found this small local maximum. And you dig and you find money in the small local maximum. And so you're like, oh, I'll just keep milking this. And so you're making only small digs nearby, right? And that's what happens in product very often, where you find this, that you're getting revenues and it's working. And so the only things you're doing are small changes around that. And sometimes when you don't rethink or have that clarity in terms of vision and strategy, you never go dig elsewhere and you discover that that's really where the gold mine was, right?
So changing a bit to something we were touching upon a bit earlier, as a PM, as a product manager, when you want to scale your influence, so like probably when you already have other PMs under you on a senior PM or group PM level even, how can you scale this influence across the organization? How can you make sure that other people are working in the same direction as you are? How can you make sure that you're all aligned?
Yeah, I'll share this from two perspectives. So one is if you're a product leader, what do you do? And the other is if you're an individual contributor, what do you do?
That's
As a
perfect.
product leader, what you really want is you want every product person under you to write up a product vision for their product and have a strategy for their product. And so that, vision and strategy, when you all write them in the same format, like I was describing, it almost starts to look like an API between teams where you're able to communicate better because at a glance, I can tell where you and I are aligned and where there might be overlaps or gaps, right? So that is what you want at a product leadership level, where every product person under you is able to take ownership of their product vision and strategy. And it's clear how everyone is collaborating together. And also, what's the goal of you, or what's your vision for your whole portfolio, right? And what you want out of it is, remember that balance between vision versus survival, that all of these product managers are thinking like you. And it's not like each product person thinking, oh, this is my product's priorities, and I don't care what about your product's priorities, that you're kind of all aligned in thinking about vision versus survival. So that's from a product leader's perspective. As an individual contributor, if you're a product manager, the way you want to use this and scale your influence is you want to have this vision and strategy that you've written up for yourself, but then you want to make sure that you have buy-in from other people around you. And the way you do this is you could either do this as a group exercise where you ask others to fill this out too, and then together you come up with the shared version. Or you can write this up and then ask for feedback. The one thing I'll say is that if you're not clear and if you aren't guiding this group exercise without this clarity in your own mind, it's like herding a bunch of cats, and the end result you might come up with is really diluted, where everyone is using big words, but the vision itself doesn't mean very much. And that's what you want to guard against.
Mm-hmm.
But you can help spread that clarity through vision strategy. And the one last thing I'll say is you can use this exercise of vision versus survival, whether you're talking to stakeholders to share what you're going to do in terms of features or push back on, or you can even use this with your own product team, with engineers and designers, to talk about your sprint plan. I often use this in sprint plans to say, this is stuff we'll do because it's important. This is vision debt I unfortunately have to take on, or here's how we're going to invest in the vision. But I start to get people to think like me. And the biggest thing you want is, by sharing your rationale in this way, you want to make your role almost redundant. The ideal scenario that you want, and this happened to me once where I had written a user story, and the developer, she came to me and she said, I understand that this is what you're really intending, but it sounds like the way we should do this is really by doing it in this other way instead, right? Like, she understood what I was intending, which was really my rationale, as opposed to what I was asking for in that user story.
Yeah.
So when you get developers who start to tell you this is what we should do instead, that's great. You're communicating rationale.
That's super cool. That's actually something we were discussing in the past Product Weekend event, that what you aim for is not like a perfect user story or whatever. What you aim for is common understanding. So whatever is the tool or the thing that you use, what you want is that everyone is in the same page. So actually, using that for planning, it's something I haven't considered, but it sounds like a very useful thing. Yeah.
And in fact, this is strategic planning season for all of next year. This is a wonderful time to put it all together for strategic planning.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to start doing that tomorrow.
On the sprint planning. And to make yourself irrelevant, you go up to the board, you just draw the X and Y axis, and you leave the room, and you let the developers and the designers. That's cool.
Yeah, let's go now for a little bit of what's coming next, actually for you too. So let's talk a little bit about the retreat. I know you were one of the first ones at the first edition regarding Product Weekend retreat after Productized. What inspired you about that weekend, actually?
So what really inspired me about Product Weekend was, we were a group of like 15 people, and there was so much psychological safety, and the level of conversations we were able to have about product was phenomenal, because at the end of the whole retreat, Sergio asked the question, what did you learn and who did you learn it from? And every one of us, our answers to that were so incredibly varied, in that it wasn't any one person that we were learning from. It was truly one of those cases where group IQ was higher than any individual IQ, right? And that is phenomenal as a learning opportunity. And so that inspired me to talk to João and Sergio about actually organizing a radical product thinking product weekend, so that this way we are doing full immersion into being vision driven as a whole group. And this can include not just product managers, but also design people and people from engineering across the organization, like all the key influencers. We bring them together and we create this immense psychological safety where you are able to think through vision, strategy, etc., but also all the real challenges in applying this in your organization, like the organizational change and the culture change that's required. And then have a plan for how are you going to bring this organizational change when you actually go back. That's, I think, the most powerful aspect of what we can do together in this product weekend for companies that I'm super excited about.
Yeah, I can have a couple of things. Yeah, we have this plan of doing mainly two angles of it. One of them more for leaders from any company to get together and learn from other leaders at other companies, and together learn to become more vision driven and understand how they can bring this way of thinking and these tools to their own companies and share the knowledge and then implement on their day-to-day. But we're also, that's what Radhika was focusing more on, doing this for a company and bringing the different people within the organization. And we deeply believe that both of them are very powerful to have this way of thinking and absorb this knowledge in an environment with complete psychological safety, and where you connect with people in a deeper way that you typically don't connect on a professional event. So yeah, we're really, really excited about it. And here's the shout out. If it resonates, if it sounds interesting for anyone, feel free to reach out to any of us, either Radhika or one of us, or to the Product Weekend page as well, or email, whatever. And just reach out. And we're happy to also hear feedback and consider other ideas, but this is one of the most exciting projects we've been working on.
Great. So let's go for the spring questions now. Radhika, one digital product you will struggle to live without?
A digital product I would struggle to live without: Signal. I use Signal even for messaging within my own family. And I really appreciate the fact that it is open source and that it is truly private as opposed to WhatsApp.
True. Now, what's the most underrated skill in product management?
The ability to do good user research. Very often, we talk about getting customer feedback, but this ability to be good at doing user research and taking the time to actually write user interview questions and know how to phrase questions so that your bias and what you want to hear does not come across, I find that skill has been rare.
So everyone needs to read the mom tests. So, and lastly, if you could shadow any product manager or leader or anything similar for a day, who would it be?
So I'm going to expand the definition of product leader to someone who applies product thinking. And if I could have absolutely my magic wand and anyone I could shadow, it would be the Singaporean Prime Minister. The reason is all of Singapore is run like a product. And living there for 2.5 years, I was absolutely fascinated by how the country is run like a product. And this is in Singapore's history. I write about this in the book as well. But there's so much product thinking and how they think about it. Singapore is the only country that'll tell you that this is our plan for 2050, or they give out 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 50-year plans, and they actually go deliver on those plans. So I would love to shadow the Singaporean Prime Minister and see kind of how he thinks about such long-term plans when, most product managers struggle to put out something and this is coming out in the next year, right? And they make 50-year plans and deliver on it. I am absolutely fascinated by that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. These product leaders, they are just talking about a piece of software that's in your phone, and they're talking about the whole country. And
Certainly a country.
It's amazing.
So now let's go for our release notes. Moita, what we are?
Let's go. A lot of juice in this episode. I'll try to be quick and to the point. So one thing we started talking about was the fact that product is a way of thinking and a life skill that can be applied to anything. Selling is also an important life skill. And having a good manager that empowers you and is able to spread their thinking to their reports earlier in your career can make a huge difference in your life. Then we talked a lot about product diseases. I'm not going to go into the details. I'll just name the 7 of them. And if you want to get into details, we discussed each of them in the episode. So the hero syndrome, the pivotitis, the obsessive sales disorder, the narcissist complex, the locked-in syndrome, hypermetricemia, hope I pronounced it correctly, and the strategic swelling. So those are the 7 product diseases that are easy to fall into. And having the vision-driven approach is the way to avoid some of these challenges. It's the vaccine that we can take. Then we talked a bit about the influence of individual contributors. How can they apply this kind of thinking even if they are not in a leadership position? And what they can do is create a shared sense of purpose and a clarity of vision for themselves and within their teams. So having that, it can be the stepping stone or the baseline to then have these conversations with relevant stakeholders and try to influence outside of the team. But still, as long as you have this culture within the team can be highly productive and drive in the right direction. Then another thing was standing up and drawing on the board the X and Y axis of the survival, short term versus the long term, which is the vision. And ideally, you have things that fall in the both good for the long term, for the vision and for the survival. But eventually, you have to take vision depth at some point, and other times you also have to take things that are not so good for the short term, and in order to invest in the vision. So you have to balance this vision depth with vision investment. And Radhika, feel free to jump in if I'm missing anything or being...
That's great. I'm loving the summary.
Cool.
We covered a lot.
Yeah, we did, for sure. Then, one thing we hear a lot, that vision needs to be inspirational and the short sentence, and basically that's pure BS. We want the vision to be specific and to clarify what's actually the change that we're making in the world so that it can guide our actions. And this vision should give clarity on 5 things: on the who, on what's the problem and the status quo, on why the problem needs solving, what's the end state that we want to achieve, and how we're bringing about this change. And the main point of having this clarity and following the radical product thinking structure is to force you to answer these hard questions and get the whole team on the same page. And also, this vision should not be a set in stone thing, otherwise you may fall into the locked-in syndrome, and it should rather be revisited either every 6 to 12 months and ask the question, is it still valid? Yeah, then we talked a bit about having an iterative approach instead of being vision-driven. And what we discussed is that iterations are good for moving fast and moving faster, which is still important. But if you don't have clarity of vision, you'll be moving faster in different directions, running in circles, and you're not moving in the right direction. So it's not one or the other, it's one for the other to make sense, right? Another thing we talked about was the fact that having this same language to express the vision and the strategy and so on helps communicate between teams and between different people. So it helps you scale your influence, and it basically works as an API to communicate between teams. Finally, one nugget that I think it's relevant, especially for earlier career PMs, is to use this vision versus survival matrix for sprint plannings. I think that's a good thing that people can start applying from Monday. And also, lastly, we talked about the Product Weekend Retreat. We had the first one recently here in Lisbon, and we'll have another one and eventually a few more next year using the radical product thinking approach. And we're very, very excited about it. And reach out. I think I mentioned that before, but just in case. Yeah. Reach out if you have feedback or if it sounds interesting for you. How does that sound? Did I manage to cover it all?
Absolutely.
Super.
Amazing.
So, thank you for this 1 hour.
Thank you for having me here. I think we covered so much. And as you said to me after the Productized conference, your content is always so dense in terms of all you cover. And I think today was no exception.
Yeah, it was really, really insightful conversation. Thanks a lot for that.
But thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure to see you guys again.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of the Product Weekend podcast. Please take some time to review us on Spotify or your favorite stream app. And don't forget to check our next episode with Tammy Reese, where Moita and Tujal will have a wonderful chat with her.